It's time.
Good evening and welcome back to the War Room, everybody. Appreciate y'all for being here. I am your host, Pistols. This is the Front Office Podcast. And as you can see, today's episode, we get back into the philosophy of fantasy football. How to build a winning roster. Most managers focus on the players, okay? Winning comes from how you roster them, how it's built. You need all these things to come together as one in order to build a winning roster. They draft the players, right? But if you're smart about it, you draft the roster. Okay, you have to have balance, and that is the biggest thing: is balance and flexibility within your rosters. That difference is everything. Having depth and having a perfectly built roster. No, not perfect. Nothing's perfect. But having everything that fall into place and you have the depth and you have the ability to adapt and think long term opposed to week after week, that is the formula for a winning roster. It's not about your individual picks. It's about how everything works together. Okay? The structure will create the consistency week in and week out. So you don't have these big roller coaster weeks. You're going to stay consistent, and that is going to win you most weeks, probably into the playoffs, most likely the championship. First thing I mentioned, like I said, you have to have balance rather than overstacking. Too much of one position will create weakness because you can only start so many. If I have 6 of the best wide receivers in the league, what good does that do me because I can only start 3 at a minimum between your two spots and your maybe a flex in there. But having too many wide receivers or having too many running backs or even too many quarterbacks, you just start focusing on which guy do I start every single week? Who is going to get the points? This and that. Now, if you build it the right way and you build for the flexibility and you have a core set of guys, those become your starters week in and week out. That's what creates the consistency, and that is what is going to score you points week in and week out. Floor versus ceiling. Floor versus ceiling is an interesting one because your roster needs both. Floor gives you the stability. The ceiling is what wins the weeks. The ceiling is the highest points that a player can, maximize week in and week out. The floor is the minimum amount of points that a player is going to get week in and week out. So a guy like CeeDee Lamb, his ceiling is very high because he's a high targeted guy. His volume is there. His role is pretty stable in the Dallas Cowboys offense. His floor is also very stable. Now, when you think ceiling and when it comes to roster construction, having a guy like CeeDee Lamb, your ceiling is probably in the mid 20s for standard scoring leagues, basically. Maybe a little bit more if you're in a PPR league. If you're just in standard scoring, you probably get a half point per reception. So that can vary, from league to league. Every league is different. Every league is going to have a different set of rules. It's just the way it goes. Like I said, the ceiling is what is going to win you weeks. The floor is going to is going to give you that stability. So if the floor for CeeDee Lamb is 15 points, it's a pretty high floor. It's a pretty stable number. Guys that have high volume like Puka Nacua, whose ceiling is probably a little bit higher because he has more volume. It's just the way that the Rams offense work. Sean McVay, he likes to use his superstars, and both wide receivers, by the way. Davante Adams had like 14 touchdowns last year, and Puka Nacua I think had like 10 or 11. So it also helps, yes, that you have a quarterback that won MVP and threw for like 50 touchdowns. But either way, that is a very stable environment. That is a very stable structure. The way that they have their rosters built, Now, the same thing has to translate into your fantasy roster because, like I said, if you have too many of one position, it becomes oversaturated. You start second guessing yourself. And when you start second guessing yourself, then you start leaving points on your bench. And you ultimately lose the week. And it just gets very, very frustrating week in and week out. Bench strategy. Speaking of benches, your bench is not for backups. I do not use my bench on my rosters for backup players. I use it for the upside of players. Chase the breakouts. When you draft your bench, it's guys that have potential to just be great. A prime example of a bench guy would be like Chris Olave. He's probably teetering on that wide receiver 2, maybe flex guy, but there's of course wide receivers that are gonna pan out to be better. And of course, I'm all speculating. I know we're only in April. We're getting to the nitty gritty here of starting to think about how rosters are going to be built, especially now that the draft is over. Offenses are really going to start taking shape when OTAs come and training camps and all that fun stuff. But you want to be able to have a solid bench to kind of make sure that obviously injuries happen to you. So you want to have those guys that are on your bench that are ready to plug and play. But you want to create a bench full of guys that have a solidified role on their team. When they have a solidified role on their team, then it makes it a lot easier to be able to play them in your starting lineup, especially when bye weeks start coming around. If injuries do happen, you want to be able to look at your bench and go, who can I put here that is still going to be pretty consistent? Where's the floor? Where's the ceiling? Where are my points going to be? And again, like I said, Chris Olave is probably one of those guys, maybe a Terry McLaurin, even though he is a starter in Washington. And now with Jaden Daniels coming back from his injury that took him out most of the season last year, he's probably teetering more wide receiver 1, maybe wide receiver 2. It would be more realistic. But you have to have these guys, like Jameson Williams is a guy that comes to mind as well from the Lions. Doesn't have a whole lot of volume, but his volume did increase over the second half of the season last year. But he's really that deep play guy that, hey, you're really looking to hit a home run. Rookies are always good for that too, is when you're drafting late into the later rounds to take a shot on a guy who is probably going to come out and solidify his roster spot on any given team. We're going to know rosters, of course, as training camp comes along. Your first round guys, this year's draft, as I said in the last episode, was mainly, it was not the strongest draft I've ever seen. Wasn't the weakest draft I've ever seen, but it was a lot of defensive players in this one. So your offensive guys really kind of just trickled in there here and there. Your Ohio State wide receivers are always usually pretty good. Ohio State produces very, very good wide receivers. A couple guys I already mentioned, Chris Olave, Terry McLaurin, and a guy like Garrett Wilson. The roles on their teams have been solidified, so the volume is going to be there. Now it does, of course, it comes down to opportunity. Is the opportunity going to be there? What's the quarterback situation like? Is he going to be able to stay protected? Is he going to be able to get the ball to his superstars? Last year, the best example I can give is probably like Ted McMillan or Ibuka from Tampa Bay. Both of those guys were probably drafted as bench guys, but you were very comfortable starting them. Ted McMillan obviously won Offensive Rookie of the Year, where Ibuka really probably could have, he gave him a run for his money for that title there. But those guys, they were, Ted McMillan came in as an instant starter for Bryce Young. Ibuka sat behind Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. Mike Evans gets hurt for majority of the season, kind of ruined his 1,000-yard streak. But Ibuka came in and really solidified a wide receiver 2 role on any roster. flexibility through structure. Um, when you build your lineup the way that you should, with balance, with upside, um, it gives you options, right? Trade flexibility, lineup flexibility, guys that maybe you need there's a position of need for you, maybe either a tight end, quarterback, running back, and if you have those wide receivers that consistently put up points, your trade value goes up, and it doesn't matter because they're sitting on your bench anyway, just collecting dust, and that goes with any position. Draft a couple running backs that have upside, and if they become consistent, then again, that could just be another avenue for you to explore, whether it be through a trade. Waivers come into play here too, as if a guy is just sitting out there not on anybody's roster. Waiver claims are huge. We can always gather what we need through that. Thinking long term, and this is what I said earlier in the episode, when we kind of came on and did the intro. You have to think long term. Fantasy football is a long season, and you have to draft for the season, not just week 1, not just week 2. Your roster needs to be able to evolve, and what I mean by that is just figuring out where your strengths are, figuring out where your weaknesses are, and adapting throughout the season. It's just one of those things that comes up that people just kind of say, okay, where are my big points at? All right, well, I have a bye week in week 5, and 7 of my players are on a bye week, because I personally don't draft for bye weeks, but it's one of those things that you do have to think about, and how you want to build your roster, and how you want to take control and make sure you're able to have that flexibility, and you're drafting for the entire season. Like I said, guys late in drafts too. These are the guys that are going to kind of fill in, especially when teams start clinching their playoffs. Teams we see all the time, they sit their starters. Who can I throw in there that is either still fighting for a playoff spot, or the volume is just incredible that the points are still going to be there. So roster construction is super, super important. You just have to have all those things come together for you. Again, it's, balance your roster out. Don't overstack at a certain position, regardless. A lot of the times people will they'll draft a certain position, and they'll draft a lot of it because they think that everybody just wants to make trades. I see it in every single league where, guys stack running backs. They'll draft 4 or 5 running backs in a row before they even think about wide receiver. Well, you can only start 2 of them, or 3, depending on a flex. Same with the wide receivers. Tight ends, you can only start 1 unless you want to start another one in your flex. But it's just one of those, the most important aspect of fantasy football is making sure your roster is built to finish an entire season. Now, like I said before, injuries happen. I can't help them. They're part of the game. There's no fault of anybody on the field. A freak hit can break a guy's leg. A certain cut can tear a ligament. We saw quarterbacks go down with Achilles injuries because they went to step up in the pocket and they just stepped wrong. So having that flexibility and drafting for the entire season and not just week 1 or the beginning of the season is key. All these things. Make sure your floors are high. Make sure your ceilings are higher. Keep your bench light. Keep your bench full of upside and potential. Be flexible. Always think long term. Put all that together, and that's a winning roster in my book. Like I said, I've been part of many leagues. I've been doing fantasy for almost 20 years. I've seen it all. I've been in every kind of different league you can imagine. Having too much of one position can hurt you. A lot of the times my rosters lack quarterback play. Like I said, I'm not a guy that drafts one of the top guys early on. I like to wait on my quarterback because I can still get a really, really good quarterback in the 10th, 11th, 12th round if I'm looking at like a Dak Prescott or Even last season was like a Matthew Stafford, who even Jared Goff, even high volume passing offenses that will just points will be there regardless. Um, so stop drafting the players, start building the roster. Prepare now, win later, because the structure is what wins the league. If you have that structure, you're looking at a pretty solid fantasy league. That is, it's going to be a short stream today. Still Sabres playoff hockey. I can hear it in the background. So I appreciate you for being here. Thank you guys for tuning in. This is the Front Office Podcast. Welcome to the War Room. We'll see you on the next one. Go like, go comment, go subscribe to the YouTube. You'll see this episode up there in a couple days, Thursday, whatever time it might be. Thanks, guys. See you later.